Minister Loustau-Lalanne, thank you very much for taking the time to meet with us today.
Pleasure is mine.
As a beautiful paradise in the Indian Ocean, Seychelles competes with many island nations throughout the world, from the Caribbean to Southeast Asia to the Pacific Islands. So in that context, what would you say are Seychelles' main competitive advantages compared to your regional and global competitors?
I think the first one is that it's our smallness of size. We're the smallest nation in the world. We have a group of islands which are clean, unspoiled, pristine. We have safe, secure environment. And we have opted from day one to go for an upmarket clientele. And I think this is what makes us distinctly different from most of the other touristic destinations now.
As Minister of Tourism, of course, you're in an important position, as 60% of the economy depends directly and indirectly on tourism in Seychelles. So what would you say are, from a tourism point of view, the main advantages of this sector, the main strengths that this sector has, and what are the main challenges facing tourism in Seychelles?
Well, as I said, I think as we aim for the higher end, we don't have too much of a fluctuation in visitor arrivals in Seychelles. And going for the upper end, we tend to also offer things that are small, discreet, and expensive. So the return on that investment for us is quite high. So that's the first thing. The challenge that we have, I think, is mainly to do with our human resources. Being a small island nation, to find qualified Seychellois to provide the service that we'd want at that level, I think that remains a bit of a challenge. Although we've embarked on a program to ensure that we remedy that challenge.
One of the major changes over the past few years was the sustainable tourism strategy and sustainable tourism label. And there are three aspects of that sustainable tourism strategy that I would like to discuss a little bit. The first one is, of course, when we mention sustainable development, we think about environmental preservation. What are the Seychelles policies in terms of environmental preservation at the moment, and how can they still be improved further?
Right. Now, I don't know of any nation in the world that has put aside half of its land under conservation. So 50% of our land mass in Seychelles, which is not very big, by the way, it's about 470 square kilometers. Half of it is under conservation, so you cannot build on it anything. So that's a big sacrifice for a start that we have done. So again, I ask the question, which other nation has gone that far to do it? And I don't think there's very many. So I think this is one of the best things that we've ever done. Now, to remain sustainable, you've got to ensure that you do things in a way that people will find that environment forever in a day, remain in that same health, if you want. And by preserving half of the environment, we give it a better chance, because the natural environment, once you protect it, has a great way of bouncing back without too much human interference. So for as long as we maintain that policy, I think the Seychelles will remain sustainable in terms of the product that we offer. Now, in terms of the services that we provide in Seychelles, we have a bigger challenge, because we import practically everything that feeds the visitor, and that feeds us, for that matter. So we need to have a very delicate balance as to how we go about doing that.
Another plank of the sustainable tourism strategy is economic empowerment of the people of Seychelles, of course. I guess a part of that is job creation and employment, which the Seychelles Tourism Academy plays a role in. How has the tourism development of the past couple of decades, past decade, how has it affected the standard of living of the Seychellois people? And how does it contribute to empowering them economically?
First of all, our policy has always been to try and give the Seychellois an edge in the tourism industry. What I mean by that is there are certain developments, certain services in tourism that are solely reserved for the Seychellois to invest in. And then we also allow a partnership between a Seychellois investor and a foreigner. And there are in some cases where the investment is of a higher magnitude, where we only allow foreigners. And again, we have caveats in terms of the staffing. You need to have a certain level of staffing which is controlled between expatriates and locals. Our tourism academy trained in the past only at the very basic level of tourism services, it's like barmen, housekeepers, that sort of level of certificate level in tourism. And we found that we needed to change it. So we are now training for supervisors, management levels, which is something that we've just recently started because we realize that unless we do that, the participation of the Seychellois is going to be compromised.
Finally, the final plank that I want to expand upon in the sustainable tourism strategy is what was called cultural preservation or cultural integration. How do you expand tourism and bring fairly large numbers of people every year into the country without diluting the local culture?
Culture is always a bit of a distraction when you're doing tourism. So we've thought of a different way of incorporating our culture in our tourism. Now, what we've decided recently, and we'll soon pass a piece of legislation that will allow us or give us the legal bite for us to implement this, is to bring the Creole touches, and what I mean by that is the food, the music, the art, into the hotel. So we have made it part and parcel of our classification requirement. When you classify a hotel 3-star or 4-star or 5-star, you get additional points if you incorporate in your hotel a Creole menu. If you have a piece of artwork in the room, we're not saying if you've got 100 rooms, you need 100 paintings of Seychellois artists. We are not saying that. We're saying you need a few of them, and if you do, you get more points towards it. So we are trying to bring the Creole culture into the hotel environment through this classification standard.
Of that 2011 to 2020 master plan, of which the sustainable tourism strategy was a part, what is left to be implemented in the near future?
Well, I think we need to go a little bit more on the renewables. We need to be a bit more aggressive on our renewable energy. We need to renew our wastewater treatment so that we are able to use it on the premises of hotels. So we've got to rethink our renewable energy chapter and be a little bit more aggressive in its implementation.
You mentioned earlier the fact that half of the country's surface is reserved as a natural reserve without any possibility of construction. On that note, there was actually recently a freeze on all new large hotel buildings, which recently you approved only 18 hotels to be built at the moment, but everything else is frozen for the moment in terms of those developments. Is the country close to reaching its carrying capacity in terms of the number of people that it can bring to the island? And if so, how do you continue developing the revenue from that sector without necessarily bringing in more people to the country?
This is a very good question, actually. When I was in tourism in the past, we had a carrying capacity of 150,000 tourists. We said when we get there, that would be it. Yet last year we made a record of 304,000 tourists. So with hindsight, we can check whether the carrying capacity of 150 and the assumptions we made to reach that carrying capacity, whether we could validate it or not. Now, 304,000 tourists in 2016 has had an impact. We have traffic jams in Seychelles. Seychelles is now, because of its tourism development, a high-income country. Our GDP per capita is about $25,000 per head. So we have created, if you want, a little bit of congestion in our development. We recently had a tourism capacity done again in September 2016. And it is some of the recommendations from this tourism carrying capacity study that has caused us to maintain this moratorium on large hotel development. It doesn't stop the Seychellois from investing in their own hotel development, but it is limited to 15 rooms. You must realize that a large hotel in Seychelles is anything from 25 rooms and upwards. And the largest hotel is only 300 rooms or thereabouts. So we will continue to validate the carrying capacity every so often. You cannot stop development. You know, you have to manage it. We have been in the past probably managing 1 or 2 years ahead. We've got to think longer term. We've got to have a plan to address the development within the next 10, 15, 20 years. We've got to think forward and have a framework to manage this within that time frame. We've been doing it a little bit too short term in the past.
Of course, expanding revenue without expanding the number of customers would be an increase in yield, and business tourists account for 7% of the entire tourism numbers, but account for 23% of spending. So is that a sector that you were planning on developing? And if so, what is your strategy in that regard?
Yes, I'm not really very keen on just having numbers. And unfortunately, for a little too long, we've just been talking about visitor arrival numbers. So when we reach 306, there's a bit of a euphoria. We've done great. I much prefer to look at the spend of the tourist. So I'm happy to get half of it and 15% more on the revenue than what the 304,000 would have brought. But for you to get there, you need a slight shift of emphasis. You know, we had a campaign that talked about affordable Seychelles. Now, it's a great slogan to have affordable Seychelles, but we have seen its impact. It's better, in my view, to go back and aim for a more upmarket clientele. We have the product that will follow. And selling Seychelles more expensive than any other destination, again, because we're too small to allow this to be, this delicate balance to be upset. We can sell Seychelles 30% more expensive than anywhere in the world, and we will still fill it. And that needs to be the strategy. So we need to refresh the product. We need to have hotels that are new, that have a bit more space, because luxury goes with more space now. You see, we don't necessarily have it. We have some products that is very luxury in Seychelles, and we have led the way. You know, when you heard about ecotourism recently, it was the buzzword. We've been practicing it for 20 years in the Seychelles. So that's what we need to do, you know, and I think we can still adjust the strategy to reach that target.
Location is a major factor. You're 1,000 miles away from the closest country. In that context, of course, your airports and your port facilities are crucial, vital to the economy here. There's a plan to open a new airport terminal in the very near future. You're also expanding your porting facilities. Can you elaborate on what will this bring to the table and what is in the pipelines for not just the new airport, but what specifically will be different at this new airport?
Yes, I think the airport, as we speak, is too congested at peak times. You know, if we could schedule a plane once every hour, we could get 24 planes in a day. But life is not as simple as that. You know, we get 6 planes within 1 hour, and it gets far too congested. And that's not acceptable, especially if you're going to go to the high end. So we have to make a conscious decision and build a brand new airport. We cannot continue to just hack around with the existing airport and try to make it more facilitating. So we will need to build new. And when we build new, we need to build new for the next 30 years. We should not go and build new for 2 or 3 years. And so I was saying to you earlier, we're always planning for catch-up. And currently we are catching up, and it won't work. So we need to integrate the international airport with the domestic airport to keep everybody within pretty much one roof. We can convert the existing airport here for cargo, because as I said, you know, we bring everything people need. And you know, if you want to fly a fruit can bear a high cost of air freight, and the tourist will pay for it. If he needs strawberries at 2 in the morning, we should be able to fly it to him and offer it, and he will pay for it. So we will convert the cargo, the current passenger terminal into a cargo terminal, so it will not go to waste. So I think that's the strategy. On the port, we will not become a big transshipment hub like our friends have it in further north in the Middle East. But we need to also think about improving transshipment cargo in Seychelles. And this is long-term planning. So the intention is to double the quay space here to allow for cargo ships to bring containers, not just for us, and take refrigerated containers full of fish from Seychelles out, but also stack and hold containers for Africa coming from Asia or vice versa in the Seychelles. So that would be the strategy and the plan going forward with the port.
I was going to bring up the congestion in the airport, so I'm happy to see that that's part of the strategy.
It is unacceptable. Today it is unacceptable. You know, I will tell you, we should clear a passenger within 45 minutes of him setting foot in the terminal building. Well, at the moment it takes an hour 10 to an hour 20 minutes. So it's 30 minutes too long, and it cannot continue to happen that way.
How does Air Seychelles, the flagship airline of the country, come into that aviation strategy of the country at the moment?
You know, in 1983 I started Air Seychelles, and at that time, it was not our dream to become a national carrier with such importance. We almost went bankrupt not so long ago, 5 years ago now, but we've managed to resurrect a problem, and today Air Seychelles is flying in pretty stable air. And Air Seychelles is a major carrier at the airport today here. It carries probably about 35 to 40% of the visitor arrivals to Seychelles, and a good 50% of all Seychellois that leave Seychelles to go overseas. It's creating Seychelles as a small transit hub between passengers from Southern Africa and India at the moment transiting through Seychelles, and also traffic going to Europe from the Vanilla Islands, which is further south of us, up to Europe. So Air Seychelles' strategy and mandate has changed slightly. But we have to allow them to do this if we want for Air Seychelles to be a player in this open sky policy that we have. Because today, as you know, we have an open sky air transport policy, and everybody can come here, and certainly they are here as well.
Of course, aviation is in your portfolio, and that's something that you have a lot of experience in. I want to go through quickly over your resume because it's quite extensive. You started as a pilot. You worked on you entered the board of Air Seychelles in 1982 to 1988, before entering the government in the Ministry of Transport at the time. Later, you served in the Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and in the Seychelles Tourism Board, of which you were the CEO. What are you proudest of in your accomplishments, and as Minister of Tourism and in your future endeavors, what would you still like to accomplish?
Well, that's a difficult question. I think, to put it in context, you know, there's a time for everything. I think what we've achieved, not only me, but I think what the country has achieved in the early 80s, in the 90s, if we were to try and do it today, we would never be able to do it. It is practically impossible. If I were to say to you, go and start an airline now in Seychelles and create Air Seychelles, no matter how good you are, you will never be able to do it. So there were times and circumstances that allowed us to do certain things. And I'm happy that we did the right things. You know, Air Seychelles is the insurance of our tourism policy. You know, a lot of countries, you know, they say, well, let airlines bring tourists to our country. Why do we want to risk the business? But the day they decide not to come, you don't have a tourism business. And Seychelles cannot not have a tourism business because everything will just fall away. So I think that is probably one of my biggest achievements. So what I want to do now is to maybe consolidate the tourism industry and make sure that we keep Seychelles as it is. Because what we are selling is just that pristine, unspoiled environment, and we cannot afford to spoil it. So that's what I would like to do, just consolidate and make sure that visitors come, they have a great time, they leave us lots of money, so that we can pleasure, retire, and drink Sebrew under the sun.
I think we can cross our fingers and knock on wood for that to continue to happen. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thanks so much. Thank you.